while most of Europe had knights, castles, chivalry, and fair damsels dancing. A battle-hardened army with unquenchable ambition reached the gates of Europe, the Middle East, and Japan, only to be stopped. The intriguing questions are how and why. The rise of the Mongols began on the harsh steppe of Central Asia, where survival required discipline, mobility, and constant warfare. Out of these battles emerged Genghis Khan, whose original name was Temujin, who unified the fractured Mongol tribes in the early 1200s. Genghis Khan's forces used some tactics that were not entirely new. For example, horse archers were used against the Roman Empire over 800 years earlier. However, what made the Mongols so unique is that they used a combination of different tactics to overcome and overwhelm their enemies. Later we'll see how their enemies adapted and stopped them. The Mongols were a fully mounted army. Each soldier often had multiple horses, allowing them to travel enormous distances, sometimes up to 100 miles a day, and outmaneuver slower infantry armies. Enemies couldn't predict when and where they would strike next. They had advanced tactics like signal flags, drums, and horns to act like a single coordinated unit in a chaotic battle. They pretended to retreat, and when the enemy broke formation to pursue them, the Mongols would turn around, surround, and destroy them. The Mongols used a decimal organization system of tens, 100s, 1000s, and 10,000s, which was logical and made the army easier to command. They also used terror as a weapon by spreading fear far and wide. So let's look at what typically happened when a Mongol horde approached a city. Before attacking, they sent spies and scouts to cover the terrain and observe the enemy fortification strengths and weaknesses. They often knew more about the enemy than the enemy knew about them. Mongol envoys demanded submission from the rulers and promised mercy and protection if the city complied. They also required tribute, loyalty, and sometimes hostages. There was a stark contrast between what happened to cities that easily surrendered and those who resisted. For the ones that immediately surrendered, the Mongols could be amazingly amicable. They usually would take some valuables in tribute, like livestock and gold, conscript some men for the army, and look for any specialists like artisans, scribes, and siege engineers. The Mongols liked to integrate new conscripts into their army, so there would be less chance of group defections. A Mongol governor would usually be installed, but the city leaders might retain their authority. The market and houses were left alone, and life mostly continued on as before. The Mongols were very pragmatic in that they allowed religious activity to continue with no interference. As hard as this is to imagine, Christian knights actually fought alongside the Mongols. It's much more interesting to find out what happened when a city fully resisted, or even worse, killed the Mongol envoys. Genghis Khan took such an action as the ultimate insult and would have no mercy. The black cloud of total destruction awaited those who committed such a serious crime. First, the city would be surrounded. This was the beginning of a siege. The supply lines were cut. All escape routes were blocked. If it were a fortified city with walls, then Chinese and Persian engineers were used to build and use catapults, trebuchets, and fire weapons. Sometimes rivers were diverted. To frighten the defenders, Mongols executed prisoners in front of their walls. Survivors from other destroyed cities were used to spread fear of destruction. Like many besieging armies of that era, they looked for weak points in the fortifications and focused on where it would be easiest to attack. Once the defenses were weak enough, the Mongols might still use one of their favorite tactics, pretending to leave. If the defenders sallied forth to investigate and were ambushed, well, that was just that fewer defenders to deal with in the future. Once a breach was made, the Mongols overwhelmed their enemies with coordinated attacks from multiple sides. Soldiers plundered gold, goods, and livestock. Then the population was sorted. If the city fought to the bitter end, then the enemy soldiers were executed and large portions of the population were killed. But even so, useful, skilled people would be spared. What happened to the captured women? Watch this earlier video and find out. Many of those who weren't killed were often enslaved and relocated to a different part of the empire. Some cities were burned, but others spared, depending on the situation. Mongol warriors were at their best when in the field, arrayed against a slow-moving infantry army. Their use of the composite bow, with its long range and power, and the fact that they could fire in any direction accurately, even backwards at a full gallop, made them a deadly force to be reckoned with. In many ways, they had many similarities to the Huns from 7.5 centuries before. However, the Mongols had a much larger empire that didn't fade as fast as the Huns did after Attila's death. Promotions within the Mongol horde were based on skill, not on birthright, which was quite different than many of the noble families of Europe. Cowardice or disobedience meant severe punishment, possibly even death. This strengthened the loyalty of the horde. Even though it was a common practice to integrate foreigners into their main army, the Mongols did make exceptions for certain non-Mongol troops in interesting ways. They sent them first to bear the brunt of the enemy's defenses and suffer the resulting high losses. Also, specialized soldiers like Turkic cavalry used similar tactics and were allowed to remain a cohesive national unit. So, after conquering the largest empire ever seen on the face of the earth in the fastest time, how were the Mongols stopped? In one of the strange twists of history, it was mostly geography and the kings and rulers who had iron backbones and refused to give in when all hope seemed lost. As stated before, the Mongol horde thrived on the vast, treeless steppe plains. Their horse archers could surround, outflank, and destroy any enemy there. Even fortified cities could be overcome with the right engineers and planning. But how could they overcome a thick European forest with a swollen river? No matter how skilled they were at maneuvering, when the battle was forced into a choke point, the Mongols had a problem.